I want to thank Matt for the invitation. It's great to be here. So over the last 4 or 5 years, the main emphasis of our lab was really not so much trying to understand learning of internal models or recalibration of internal models, but trying to understand how humans are able to learn real, novel, and complex motor behaviors like playing the piano, and also through functional imaging work to understand how those skills are represented in the hierarchy of cortical motor regions. Now, so really coming here or accepting this invitation, I was feeling a little bit ambiguous about that I really didn't have so much to say about internal models per se. Now, what I want to do, though, is not talk about the main emphasis of our work over the last few years, but to present you a small series of behavioral studies that I think speak to this interesting problem of calibration of internal models or recalibration of internal models on the one side, as we've heard in Nathan Tell's talk and Kathy Collins' talk today. And on the other hand, the question of what happens when that's no longer enough, and when recalibration of an existing internal model cannot get you the behaviors that you really need to implement to do something like, for example, playing the piano. So let me start with, again, redefining what we understand when we say internal model. It's kind of a slippery slope here. In general, the purpose of the nervous system is to take some goal state and to then send feed-forward commands, motor commands to the body, and also use sensory feedback to do feedback control to achieve that goal. So this is really the general layout of what nervous systems are for. Now, when we say internal model, what we kind of conjure up is an internal architecture that consists of something that we call control policy that sends or computes these motor commands, but that is based now critically on some narrow representation that represents the body or the outside world. And this representation is not just fed through the incoming sensory information, but also fed through some internal prediction that is made by something that we would call a forward model. Now, from pure behavior, it's actually astonishingly difficult to kind of find really waterproof evidence that this is actually the computation that is performed. But I want to focus today on one of the, I think, telltale signs that such a model actually exists or is implemented in the nervous system. And that's the ability of the system to take sensory prediction errors, so the discrepancy between some inflowing sensory information and the prediction that the nervous system made, and use that prediction to somehow modify its motor behavior right on the next trial. And that is a very, very difficult problem, and it's termed the inverse problem of motor control. Let me just show you that this is actually not a trivial computation. Now, imagine you are one of the subjects in one of the many motor control laboratories around the world that implement a paradigm like this, where you're asked to sit in front of a robotic device, you're asked to reach with your hand to a target. You don't see your hand, but you get some visual feedback on some screen, and the position of your hand is marked with a cursor. So you reach to a target, and then on some trials, the cursor actually moves in an unexpected way. So here it moves when your hand moves slightly to the left, the cursor moves slightly to the right. So you have an error. And the question is, well, what do you do now? What should you do on the next movement? Now, in most motor control laboratories, you would actually be correct in inferring that what the experimenter did was to rotate the visual feedback by some certain degree around the origin. So here, in this case, it's a 40-degree rotation of the cursor feedback in respect to the hand. And so the logical thing on the next trial, what you should do, is you should move a little bit further to the left, so that the cursor, again rotated, would go a little bit closer to the target. And you repeat that a couple of times, and after a few trials, you would actually be able to achieve the target again and ultimately finish the experiment and get out of it. Now, that's not the only response that you could do. It could also be true that the experimenter maliciously didn't do a visual rotation, but actually mirrored the visual display around the mid-sagittal axis. So when the hand goes to the left, the cursor would go to the right, and if the hand goes to the right, the cursor would go to the left. Now, in this situation, on this single trial that you might see, the result is exactly the same. Your hand goes to the left, the cursor goes to the right. You have exactly the same error. But now the response of going to the left would make matters worse. So if you were to go to the left here, the cursor would actually go further to the right and miss the target even more. The right response, of course, is to, whoops. Sorry, is it frozen momentarily? So the right response would be actually to go further to the right, so bring the cursor closer to the goal. So now, really nice work by Daniel Wolpert's group has shown that subjects confronted with this ambiguous situation very strongly respond in a way that indicates that they understand these perturbations as visual rotations. So you can model this as kind of a Bayesian prior on a parametric space, or to think that this internal model makes some structural assumption about the world to understand this ambiguity in the sensory error that then guides the way we adapt. And so what I want to ask today is, if the current internal model that subjects have in their brain actually prefers or models the world as being consistent of visual feedback that might have a visual motor rotation, what do subjects do and how do they react when they're confronted with mirror reversals that kind of defies their current internal model and forces them to really implement something new here? What happens then? So here's a very simple experiment, also a very boring experiment, where we just had people for 4 days straight reach to a target straight ahead. Okay? And this is done with a robotic device. And because of the anisotropy of the device, you see that they reach, but they don't reach totally straight. They reach a little bit curved to the left here always. So you see this 2.5-degree error on average in the baseline trials. Now what we do then is we mirror the visual feedback. When you reach straight, you shouldn't really see it. But what they see is a small error on the screen that goes now 2.5 degrees to the right. Now, subjects actually understand that error as a visual motor rotation, and following their current internal model, start to adapt. So you see actually what they do. They go further to the left, making the matter actually worse and increasing the error roughly until they had about 15 degrees error on the screen. So they go in the wrong direction initially. Now then something happens, and over the next 4 days, they kind of turn around and start adapting to this visual motor rotation, and ultimately are pretty able to reach straight and also get the variability down again. Now the key question I want to ask is, what happens at that moment where they seem to just say, well, this internal model isn't working anymore, I really need to do something new? What learning mechanisms are kicking in that moment? So what could it be? Now, as Mark just said, when we talk about internal models, we shouldn't just talk about internal models as one internal model for the whole motor behavior. It's often useful to kind of break it down into multiple processing steps. And so it's pretty reasonable to assume that there is some model that translates visual target information, and also maybe visual hand feedback, into some plan in proprioceptive space, so knowing where in proprioceptive space to move the hand, and then maybe some internal model that deals with the dynamics of the arm and computes the forces, and that also then takes into account proprioceptive feedback to guide the movement. Now, when we are confronted with an unknown visual motor error, the first reaction is, of course, to try to change that kinematic model and try to change the parameters, so change the computation, change the output so that the response is more appropriate. Now, these internal models are very well practiced, so we've been reaching all our lives, so they are fast and very, very automatic, and that can be shown in various ways. So we would assume that if you recalibrate your internal model, you should inherit that trained automaticity for the new behavior. Now, what happens when that fails? Now, we're all humans. We have the ability to learn any arbitrary stimulus-response association. So there's nothing really that, at least when we take enough time and think about it long enough, that we can't do, right? Nothing too abstract. So one idea is that once you're really confronted with an error that really defies your current internal model, maybe engage these processes that are very slow and voluntary. so kind of response selection processes, that you see a target on the right, maybe you know that the feedback is mirror reversal, you suspect it, you just basically simply replan your movement and say, okay, there's a target on the right, I really need to move my hand to the left, and you might implement that, and then feed some other goal into the dynamic model that then computes the motor commands. So that might be how people actually initially deal with this perturbation. Now, the idea then is that new response selection, so replanning a movement in such a way, might act as a scaffold in a way for the system to construct possibly a new internal model that then might make that new computation, the mirror reverse reaching, more automatic, maybe not reaching the same automaticity of the well-trained models, but at least going faster and faster and faster and making performance better. So that's kind of the main idea, or was kind of the main idea of Sebastian Telgen, who was a PhD student in my lab. So the prediction really was then that what we should see when people learn a new internal model, establish a new internal model, that we should see it in the temporal dynamics of how they plan it. So in the beginning, they should be very slow, and then it should increasingly automatize. So that was his prediction, and that's what he wanted to test. So what he did was he took subjects and confronted them either with a visual motor rotation or with a mirror reversal perturbation and restricted their reaction time. So next to them, and every time they took a reaction time of longer than 385 milliseconds, he played a loud, annoying sound at them, and they lost a penny or so of their earnings of the experiment. So they were very motivated to actually move their reaction times below that cutoff. Now, what happens? So what Sebastian did was then, first of all, there were two potential targets in the upward direction. And he let them reach to one of the targets. And he labeled the errors. Now he looks at the reaction times. So here are the fastest reaction times, around 200 milliseconds, and the slowest reaction time, maybe 350 milliseconds. You can break these up. And we can label now the errors that they made. And because this is the mirror reversal condition, he labeled the errors in this condition that a positive, when the cursor missed the left target to the right, that would be a positive error. And when the cursor missed the right target to the left, that would also be a positive error. So non-adaptation going to the old direction would be a positive error. So in black, we see here the baseline block where there's no visual mirror reversal imposed yet. And what you can see is that the errors aren't exactly zero in this case. And the reason for this is that we only presented these two targets, and subjects kind of knew that, and they knew that a good strategy to deal with this reaction time constraint is to kind of just generally move up. So they have a slight bias for the left target to move to the right, for the right target to move to the left. But the key thing is that when we switched on the mirror reversal, this dramatically changed. So what we saw now was, first of all, that reaction times dramatically slowed, so they took more time and kind of got more penalty trials. But also that there was a clear, much clearer than here, speed dependency or time dependency of the response. So for slow reaction times, when they had enough time to think about it, they actually went in the right direction and reduced the error maybe from to 15 degrees. So if you go to the old target, you would show an error of 40 degrees. More than 20 degrees error would say that you go actually in the wrong direction. And that's what you see for reaction times that are faster than 300 milliseconds. You see that they clearly still went in the wrong direction. And then over the course of the first day, you see that that response starts to automatize. And for the same reaction time, you get actually less error, or you get the same error for shorter reaction times. Okay? When they came back the next day, they actually moved further. After 2 days of training, you can see that they still didn't reach quite the automaticity that they had for the old established mapping, but it comes closer. We've trained people now for 4 days, and it kind of itches closer and closer to this black line, but it never quite reaches it. Now, the key comparison is to the visual motor rotation, where we did the same experiment. Now the errors are labeled slightly differently. So if you don't adapt to a 40-degree rotation of the cursor to the left, a positive error for the right target is again missing the cursor, missing the target to the left here. For the left target is also now missing to the left. So when we look at the baseline now, this group actually showed the same bias at the baseline as this one. It's just that we labeled the errors here opposite direction so that averages out. So you see basically no speed dependency and 0 error on average in this group. But now the key thing is what happens when we put on the visual motor rotation. And what you see is that there's a clear 20-degree error. Again, the expected error in the beginning was 40 degrees. That reduces quickly to 20, further to 10 within the same day. But you see here very clearly that there's no significant difference between the long reaction time and the short reaction time. So there's no speed dependency, nothing like compared here in the mirror reversal. And that also continues on the second day. So we have very dramatically different speed accuracy trade-offs here. In the visual rotation, it seems like no matter how fast you react, there is some automatized process that translates the target location into a motor plan. Whereas in the mirror reversal, if you don't take enough time to pre-plan your movement, you're actually going to be much more inaccurate and be dominated by the old mapping. So it seemed then recalibrating this one can use the established automaticity of the internal model, whereas when you start with something that starts up here in response selection and then it's automatized, you might need additional time for this processing that then ultimately is automatized. Now, it makes an interesting prediction here because we think that these internal models are not just there to take a target and translate it into some motor command, feed-forward motor command, but also there to take visual hand feedback and use that to then drive online corrections during the movement. So that should also be a function of an internal model that we have. And so we should see the same speed accuracy trade-offs in these fast feedback corrections. So that's what we did. We want to model that, or study this. In the same experiment, we let people, some trials, reach to the target straight ahead, and then displaced the cursor during the movement, just shifted it over a very rapid time window here, 2 centimeters to the right. And so what people do very automatically and very fast is to correct their movement and move the hand further to the left to ultimately bring the cursor over to the right. And one way of measuring these, which is kind of a nice method that David Franklin introduced into the field, is to constrain the movement to a straight path trajectory by putting a force clamp, a so-called force clamp, in it. So programming a robotic device to constrain the movement to the straight line trajectory and simply measure the force with which the subject starts to push into that channel. So this is one of these force traces, or the average force trace in the group. What you can see, at 0 milliseconds, the cursor starts shifting here. And at roughly 110 milliseconds or so, 120, you see very clear response of the arm pushing towards the left to correct for this error. Now, in the mirror reversal, this would be, of course, the wrong feedback response. So what they should do after learning the mirror reversal is they should fully reverse that response. And now, for a target jump to the right, they should push to the right. Now, they never quite do that. So you see within the first day, they still, for the whole first day training, they still push in the wrong direction. So they always push to the right. They just reduce this response a little bit. And at the end of the first day, at about 300 to 350 milliseconds, they just move straight ahead. But early on, they still move in the wrong direction. It's only on the second day that they're able to then reverse the response and push in the right, into the right direction for this cursor jump. But again here, you see that this very early response from a 110 to maybe 180 milliseconds still is directed in the wrong direction. It never quite goes away. Even after 4 days of training, there's still a little blip here that goes in the wrong direction and reveals the old mapping. So in contrast, and I'm not showing the data here in interest of time, it seems that under visual rotations, and there the feedback response is slightly harder to measure, but it seems like there the fast feedback responses are immediately adapted. So you adapt your internal model to a visual rotation, and your feedback responses seem to immediately be adapted to take that visual rotation into account. So to summarize then, both feed-forward and feedback control under mirror reversal, we have very parallel time dependency in both feed-forward and feedback commands. So I highlighted here the response between 250 and 300 milliseconds of the system. So you see here, feedback control allows us really to measure these really early responses, where in feed-forward control, 250 to 300 is really kind of the earliest that we can measure. But you can see in both feedback on feed-forward control, early in the first day, they go in the wrong direction. In the end of the first day, they canceled out the error. And it's only on the second day that they seem to go in the correct direction for that time window. Now, we looked at this data over the time course of the training. We made a kind of, for us, very interesting discovery. And we saw something that really hasn't been seen for teaching reaching movements to humans, namely the evidence for offline consolidation. The evidence that when you end on the first day and you come back on the next day, it seemed like there was a quantum jump in your performance. You suddenly were better coming back the next day. And so that raised the issue that maybe there is a different learning mechanism involved here compared to adaptation. And that's exactly what we see. So here is the error at about 250 milliseconds for the visual rotation experiment. And we see exactly what you see typically in all adaptation experiments that I'm aware of. That over the first day, people reduce their error, they go home, they sleep a night, that's this dashed line, they come back, and immediately they have forgotten something, which they then can relearn rather quickly on the second day. But there's always some forgetting overnight. In the mirror reversal case, we saw in the one group that we first studied that the error reduced, and it seemed then coming back the next day, they immediately got better and then stayed at that level for the second day. So something might have happened overnight. Now, offline gains is a very disputed phenomenon. It's kind of hard to measure this. So we weren't quite confident that that really was qualified as good evidence for that. So we repeated this experiment in 2 other groups. So this group was tested in the morning, like this group with a 24-hour break and a night of sleep in between. This group only had a 12-hour break, trained in the evening, night of sleep, and then came back the next morning. And you see in all 3 groups there was a significant offline gain, no matter how we calculated it. In this case, we just took the average of the last block and the average of the first block, and you always saw this jump. In the feedback command, that might not be super, in the feed-forward command, this is offline gains in the feed-forward command, we saw it even clearer in the feedback command. So we looked also in the feedback command now at the force that were produced in the same time window around 250 milliseconds. And we again see that they improved their feedback command down to 0, but it then really took a night of sleep for them to come back and really go into the right direction. So you see very clear evidence for this downward jump. Now, we thought that was quite exciting because the only place that we were aware of that offline gains in human skill learning were reported and human learning were reported are relatively high level or complex tasks, namely the sequential learning tasks. So when you learn to type out a sequence on a keyboard. So that seems like a learning task that is not cerebellar dependent like vision motor adaptation, but it has much more basic ganglia dependence. And there, people have argued that they see offline consolidation and also sleep-dependent offline consolidation. And so it was the first time that we saw this at a reaching task. So we're quite excited, and because it argues that there might be some parallels in the learning mechanisms that underlie learning this new control policy for reaching movements and maybe learning more other complex tasks like sequences. Now, one interesting thing from this literature is also that these offline gains are sleep dependent, so they depend actually that you get a night of sleep. And so we wanted to test this here. So we had already these 3 groups, and then we tested another group that also had a 12-hour break, like this group, but trained in the morning and then came back in the evening. And you can see that there's no real forgetting here, but you also see that this offline gain here plotted here in this graph in this group that had a 12-hour break but no sleep seemed somewhat reduced. I have to be very careful here because the difference between these 3 groups and this group were not statistically significant. So we need to stay a little bit agnostic here if this offline gain is really sleep dependent. Similarly, in the feed-forward command, it's also this offline gain was there. It wasn't significant compared to 0, but there was also no significant difference between groups. So at this point, we don't know whether these offline gains are sleep-dependent or not, but it's very clear that these offline gains are present and very strongly present for this learning of a new control policy, but it's also very clear that if you just adapt the old control policy in a vision mode or rotation task, you don't see anything like this. You always see forgetting as typically reported. So to summarize now, what we have is we have recalibration of an old internal model. It seems to not engage new processes that are time-dependent and also involve offline forgetting when you go home and do something else. We have the phenomenon of learning a new control policy, which clearly depends on additional time-dependent feedback processes and might show offline gain in performance. Now, for the last few minutes of the talk, I want to ask the question, well, if we have these two types of learning processes, how does the brain decide to do one or the other? So what are the variables that determine which kind of domain of learning we're in? So we had studied mirror reversals. We showed that this actually depends on learning a new control policy with these time-dependent processes. We've shown that a 40 or 60-degree visual rotation is learned like recalibration, so it involves some other learning mechanism. So what about a rotation that is about 180 degrees? So like mirror reversal for if your hand reaches to the left, you're going to see the cursor going to the right. The difference is only when you reach to the upper left target, your cursor goes to the lower right. Here it goes to the upper right. So this is the difference. Would they somehow be different? So first of all, we replicated the speed dependency on the mirror reversal. I'm plotting here now the variable error on the y-axis. And what you see is that no speed dependency in the baseline. You see a very nice slowing and a nice speed dependency emerging when you switch on the mirror reversal that then over the 2 days of training starts to automatize as seen before. And the same thing is true for a 180-degree visual rotation. So there's no difference between a mirror reversal and a 180-degree visual rotation in this case. So now we have a kind of nice situation. We know that 40 and 60 degree of visual rotation are achieved through recalibration. 180-degree rotation, the nervous system kind of snaps out of that and engages some new learning mechanisms. So there must be some transition point where one goes into the other. So this is what we then try to do. We implemented a so-called gradual rotation experiment, where we started with normal reaching. So to reach at this target, your hand goes to the left, your cursor goes to the left, and then we slowly started to impose the visual rotation, rotating, in this case, the cursor clockwise to increasing degree. And this is the imposed rotation here, and the dotted line, this is the hand direction, or the cursor direction it was taken, so the adaptation here. And you see that they don't fully adapt. They kind of fall behind a little bit. And this went on till we imposed about a 145-degree rotation. So 145-degree rotation of the cursor in the clockwise direction. In this case, the subject had adapted to 55 degrees on average or so, or 60 degrees on average, and there was a 90-degree error on the screen. So up to then, everything looked like recalibration. And then suddenly, the behavior of the subject, this is group average, made somewhat a discrete jump, and that suddenly variance induced, and they kind of very quickly jumped to the right solution, now totally reversing their movement. So it's a kind of a discrete switch here. Also interestingly, when we looked at the reaction time, speed dependency of the error, we saw that up to this moment, up to this knee point, the lines were completely flat. The error increased, reaction time increased, but there was no evidence for speed accuracy trade-off. Starting at that moment, right after this bend, suddenly we saw that speed accuracy trade-off kicking in, meaning that there might have been an additional process, like a selection process, that then reduced and increasingly automatized. So the question is, what triggers this transition? What triggers the system to snap out of recalibration and go into this learning of a new control policy? So it might be that it's the amount of rotation. So maybe 145 degrees was just too much. It might be that it's the size of adaptation, meaning people might adapt to 70 degrees but not further. This would predict that people who adapt faster should also switch faster. Finally, it might be the size of the error that the subject sees on the screen, meaning when it hits 90-degree error on the screen, it might be that then the system switches. So in this case, people who adapt very slowly should also switch earlier because they see earlier a larger error. And so this is actually what we saw. Here are 3 subjects. We could model their switch point individually by fitting a state space model that models the initial adaptation and then also the switch point implicit as a model parameter. And then we can plot the the learning rate, so how good they adapted and how early they switched against each other. And we found a very healthy positive correlation, meaning that people who learned a lot, like this subject, they stay very, very close to the imposed rotation, they were actually also a subject that switched relatively late. Here's a subject that didn't learn very much, that fell behind very quickly, and that one switched much earlier than this subject. So there's some evidence, maybe it's the error size that's really the driving signal for the system to abandon a current internal model. Now I want to leave you with the last observation that I think is quite intriguing about how that comes about. How does the system figure out that there's something better out there? And so what we're looking at here is the average variability of the subjects in their reaction time and also in their initial reach direction over the course of the experiment. So the dashed line is kind of the point that the subjects on average switches. You see that well before that time, it seems that subjects increase their variability in their output. So it seems like as things start to go sour for the motor system and they can't cope with that increasing rotation, it might be that the motor system now starts injecting variability into their behavior that can serve as exploration and might show them that there's actually something better out there and that they might switch to them. So that's the summary, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to switch straight to acknowledging the people who did all the hard work. There's Sebastian Telgen, a PhD student in my lab, and Darius Pavin, who is now at UC Berkeley, who were really the driving force behind this. And I want to acknowledge my sources of funding. And I thank you for your attention.